In this last painting session, basically what I'm going to be doing is adding a few darker notes and softening edges. And I'm using just a half-inch flat, bristle flat to do that. So I'm just adding very small touches of color here and there. Sometimes I will step back and see that a detail is sort of creating a shape that I don't like. For example, in the water and in the trees, there's a few sort of dot-like shapes that I want to break up. So a lot of times I'll just pick up some paint in one part of the painting and move it to another spot to break up those sort of symmetrical or odd shapes that don't really, accentuate what I'm trying to say in that tree shape or the water shape. I hold my brush in a variety of ways depending on how I want to deposit the paint. For example, if I hold the paint very perpendicular to the canvas, I'm going to pick up paint. And if I hold it almost parallel to the canvas, usually sort of like a backhand or position, I can deposit the paint that's on the brush onto the canvas. So you'll see me hold the brush in a variety of different ways during this session. You'll also see me hold the brush either flat to the canvas with a broad expanse of the bristles, or I'll hold it to the side using the thin edge. And this gives me a variety of different marks. So I'm just picking up some white paint on my palette and just very lightly touching it to the wet paint. And it just picks off very minute flecks of the paint. There I'm holding the brush sideways to get a nice thin stroke. Now if you have enough paint on your brush, you won't pick up paint, you'll just deposit paint. But sometimes as a brush loses the pigment, it begins to pick up paint. So I'm using a nice fat stroke there. And then I want to smooth out that one edge there, and so I pull off some paint with a tissue and then soften that edge. So I'm just kind of, softening an edge here. I find that a brush stroke, if it has a sharp edge on all the way around it, it looks kind of artificial. You don't really see those kind of shapes. So I go back in and sort of soften an edge, at least one of the edges on that shape. If you don't soften one of the edges, it looks kind of calligraphic, and that's really not an effect that I want to have in my paintings. Some people use it quite effectively, so it just depends on what you're trying to do. To my eye, some of the flecks on the bottom part of the canvas are a little bit too hard edged all the way around that stroke. So I just continue to go through and soften those. Now here I've switched over to a very long filbert. And I use the filbert because I can get a very soft touch. The long bristles are almost sort of like a shock absorber. So if I want to get a very soft edge, I use that filbert. And frequently clean it off with a tissue. And I just go and very lightly touch edges. And I kind of drag out the paint, and it kind of just feathers it out. Now I might do this also with a fan brush. I might just use a very dry fan brush and use the edge and just sort of pull the paint away from the main body of that stroke. So that again is just a technique I use to soften that edge. But in this case, I just used the filbert, and it works quite well. In the final moments of the painting here, I just select a few areas that I want to modify. And again, I step back quite frequently at this stage and just sort of reflect on the painting and see where I want to change things. And often when you're up close, you really can't tell what's wrong. So if you step back, you can sort of see a more holistic, larger view of it. And sometimes you'll have certain flecks that are, creating an odd line, or a line that's too pronounced and it needs to be softened. And occasionally you'll see a line that's too soft and needs to be made a little bit more firm. So you're just, looking at things, adjusting things, very, very minute changes. Very, you're shifting very minute bits of color around on the canvas. So you're just kind of fine-tuning the edges, and as long as your values are basically right, you should be okay. This composition has a very strong value structure, so it can take quite a bit of adjustment, and it still maintains its compositional structure. So that's one thing that you want to look at, is you don't want to soften things up too much, and get a uniformity of edges. Getting a nice selection of diverse edges and diverse color is one of the things you really want to shoot for when you paint. No matter what it is you're doing, you don't want to, split the composition or the values or the edges, into 50% soft edges, 50% hard edges. You want to keep things sort of imbalanced. And then you also want to get that rhythm of imbalance sprinkled through your composition to create a nice rhythm.